This podcast is brought to you by Ideas Digest. I'm Conrad.
And I'm Matt.
Each week, two optimistic Aussie blokes explore new challenging ideas outside of our echo chamber on our totally realistic quest to achieve world peace, maybe some personal enlightenment. Is that too much of an oversell?
No, just roll the montage.
Okay.
I'm right and you're wrong.
What are you talking about? Straight men enjoy gay sex. What?
The Bible is extremely pro-abortion.
You're a sexist man who loves Jordan Peterson.
This is progressive? No, this is arson.
Do you think that kick us out?
I've done psychedelics 150 times in my life.
Why the hell should I trust you now?
Don't define me by what I do in bed.
Oh my God, these ideas can be like a membership key to particular social groups.
So break free from your echo chamber each week on Ideas Digest, anywhere you get your podcasts. It's going to be an amazing time.
Amazing.
Give us.
All right, welcome everyone to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. It's good to be here. It's always good to be here, isn't it, Troy?
Oh, it's always great to be here.
It is us doing this, and we enjoy it. We love having a little bit of a chat. Want to give a little bit of a shout out to all of our socials and things like that at the start. This year, in our show notes, you may have noticed, if you looked in the show notes, that we have a Linktree link in there, which has a link to all of our socials and all those different things. So we are now on YouTube. We've got the Facebook listener group. We've got Reddit. We've got Instagram. We've got Twitter. You can grab our merch from Redbubble. And also, if you could support us through Patreon, that is always appreciated too, as it helps with all the costs of the podcast, advertising and stuff like that. But yeah, go into the show notes, have a look at Linktree.
Yeah, and thank you to all the people that have volunteered to help out with that. Like Holly, for example, she set up the Linktree link there, and she's also been doing our Instagram, and she's also done some amazing work on some of those posts and some of those memes and bits and pieces. So big thanks to her.
They make us look really good, our volunteers, don't they, Troy? That's certainly admin that helps us with the Facebook group and also with the things like the socials with Holly. We're looking a little bit more polished.
I know, it's looking a bit swish, which is good. Now, hey man, today I feel we get a bit of, a bit sort of investigative journalist kind of feel today with what we're going to do this episode. I think this is going to be an interesting one.
It is. We better keep it to 60 minutes in theme with the investigative journalism. I didn't say that very well. That's investigative journalism.
Keep it to within 60 minutes. I see what you're saying. So you're saying we're going to be like a foreign correspondent.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Four corners, right? Oh, no. Okay, I get it. So you're making reference to that old classic 60 Minutes, which I don't know how it is in the US now, but in Australia it's become a lot more like a current affair and less, 60 Minutes-y like it used to. Have you noticed that?
It's terrible. We actually watched it last week. Just there's a story on there that piqued our interest on the ad. And yeah, it was a little bit tabloid. Wasn't impressed with it, and we won't be watching it again in a hurry.
Yeah, I mean, it always was Channel 9, but Channel 9's just become even more Channel 9, haven't they?
Yeah, it has. And for our overseas viewers in Australia, Channel 9 is, it's just one of your garden variety
network TV stations. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's rubbish. But today, nepotism.
Oh, yes. So this is a good one, nepotism, because it's just rife within Australian Pentecostalism and evangelicalism. I mean, it's rife in evangelicalism globally, to be honest, but I think this is the kind of stuff that it's just so glaringly obvious. It's just right there. And I think that Pentecostalism in Australia really, and megachurches in Australia really don't think there's anything wrong with this. They're so blind to it that they're just open, and they're even going to be like, I dare say, if any Pentecostal mega church pastors are listening to this, they're going to be going, well, what's wrong with this? This is the way we've always done it. This is the way it's always been. What are you talking about? There's something wrong with this.
Got to pass the mantle, brother. And, anyone who is not familiar with nepotism, it's the practice amongst those with power or influence of favouring relatives or friends, especially by giving them jobs. And we saw this, outside of the church in the Trump administration, where he had his daughter as an advisor, had his son-in-law as an advisor, and none of them in any sort of way had any qualifications to do those jobs except to say that they were related.
That's right. So it is very common. Did you see they joked a lot about bring your daughter to work day when he was bringing Ivanka, was that her name?
I think it is Ivanka.
Yeah, Ivanka Trump, when he was bringing her in, it was like, oh, daddy-daughter work day and bring your daughter to work day and all this kind of stuff. But, most companies and government agencies and NGOs, etc., they have rules in place to counter nepotism because it's basically not fair and it's not on. And yet we will see today, as we sort of look at what's going on in evangelicalism, a little bit in the world, but then really focusing on Australia, we're going to really see that it is rife, it is endemic, and they really don't see a problem with it.
No, they don't, unfortunately, and it is completely wrong. But it doesn't just sit within Pentecostalism, evangelicalism. It definitely sits within the world in many, many areas. And, ruling dynasties of the world is just one of them, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look at monarchies. I mean, this is what monarchies were basically based on. Nepotism. I mean, that's the idea, right? Is that it's hereditary title, it's handed on to your children. So we see that with, of course, still to this day, the British monarchy, is still very, obviously nepotistic, but they don't have the power that they once had. But nevertheless, there's still, titles that are bestowed and jobs and all that kind of thing is given to the British monarchy. I think the one that stands out to me, though, is the Thai monarchy. Yeah. So the Thai loved the older king, the one who passed away more recently, and they weren't very fond of his son. When he was the prince, there was a lot of backlash against him because he wasn't doing a very good job of being the crown prince. And then when he became the king, there's not that same love and adoration that they have, but this is who gets it. It gets given to the son, or gets, whichever son it happens to be given to for whatever reason, because that's the dynasty. The dynasty is handed on from father to son or father to daughter or whatever.
I remember my partner and I were actually in Thailand, whenever that was, 5 or 6 years ago when the king died. And we left, and he died within hours of us leaving, and friends were there at the same time. And apparently everything shut down. Like the whole country just shut down and went into mourning. So they really took that seriously. And you're right, they absolutely loved him. But the son has been... He's known for his playboy lifestyle, flying around on private jets and doing whatever he wants. So yeah, I don't think he's popular. I think you're right.
No, they're not fans. So obviously the world moved away from monarchies, right? Because it's basically not fair. And the world moved, to more democracy, whether that's just in name or whether it's really in practice. And so the idea of democracy is that everybody has a voice. I mean, that's what democracy means. It's listening to the voices of the people. And so our society, Western liberal democracies, of course, we have multi-party systems. People are voted in and out. But still, nepotism is quite strong in different areas of our world. But I want to make the point that as a society, we have moved away from the idea of giving things directly to your children because simply they are your children, or I should say giving jobs and power and positions of power to your children. So that's a really important point to make, that this is not the way the world runs, or at least Western liberal democracies. But let's talk about where we do see nepotism rife in governments today. And we are going to go somewhere with this. We just want to sort of set the scene with this. So what's the first one, B?
That would be our old mate, Kim Jong-un. And where did he come from? Kim Jong-il.
And where did he come from? Can you go that far back?
Oh, no.
Kim Il-sung.
Ah, well, there you go. See, look at you. You're a wealth of political knowledge. Look, it's a world of bad haircuts. That's what it is. But North Korea, rife with this stuff. And as we can see, it doesn't work extremely well when you see some of that secret footage that comes out of North Korea of how malnourished people are, how unwell they are, how they can't get health care. this shit doesn't work. But, they've got lots of good nuclear weapons, so that's the main thing, isn't it?
Well, the thing about them as well is that there's a spirituality, there's a almost godlike quality to these three men. And so this sort of mantle, this, lineage, divine lineage, they're sort of handed on from one generation to the next. And maybe that's already starting to sound familiar, but that's what's happening. And we, as Western nations, we look at that and go, that's bullshit. That's not the way it is at all, right? People need to be voted in, or people need to, demonstrate their merit, and then they can have positions of power, which leads us on to sort of more recent American presidential dynasties, right? So like the Bushes, for example. So we see that Bush Sr. was the president. A couple of presidents later, Bush Jr. gets in. And then when we look at the Clintons, Bill Clinton was the president, and, his wife was all of a sudden the, Secretary of State under Obama, and then she's running for president herself. If you think that's not because she's connected to the power brokers and, her husband, well, you're kidding yourself, right? Of course. So we see that even in the American system. But the difference between the American system and, say, the North Korean system is people still need to vote and people still need to choose. So ultimately, you can be connected, but that's no guarantee. Whereas in North Korea, well, it's a guarantee. So the other one, Brian, is Singapore. Now, Singapore is interesting.
Well, you have first-hand knowledge of this. You lived there.
So let me tell you about Singapore. Now, the thing about Singapore is it's dressed up as a Western liberal democracy. That is, multi-party state, parliament, yada, yada. But the reality is the same party has been in power since the 1960s, since they declared independence from the UK, and also independence from Malaysia. So they were briefly part of Malaysia. And there's a guy by the name of Lee Kuan Yew. Now, the thing about it, as I said, is it's dressed up as a liberal democracy, but it's actually a single party system. And what happened when Lee Kuan Yew, he was just in power forever, for a very long time. And then when it was time for him to retire, his own son wasn't really old enough or experienced enough to take over. So what he did was he handed it on to this guy named Goh Chok Tong. And Goh Chok Tong became the prime minister. But Lee Kuan Yew stayed in this role called senior minister, which basically meant I'm still in control, I'm still in power. Do you remember it was kind of like that with Putin, when Putin stepped out for a little while because the constitution said he couldn't have it. So he stepped out, gave it to someone else for a period of time, and then came back. Lee Kuan Yew never came back. But what he did do eventually was he handed on the power, or Goh Chok Tong handed on the power to his son, Lee Hsien Loong. All right. So eventually he gave the power to his son. Now, again, the thing about it is it's supposed to be a Western style liberal democracy, but really it's just very much like North Korea. But all the show is there, all the dressings are there of, it's not nepotistic, but of course, in true Asian fashion, he handed everything that he had on to his firstborn son.
It's interesting, isn't it? Corruption begets corruption as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's an institutionalized corruption. That's the thing about Singapore. That's the thing that I noticed when I was there. It's not illegal. The laws are actually supporting those in power and those that are holding the power to maintain the power. So it's institutionalized corruption is the best way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. Scary stuff, but it's everywhere, isn't it? But then we come back to the Pentecostal evangelical scene. Frank Schaeffer from a few weeks ago, he really spoke about this, didn't he, in his experience about his father and the mantle being passed to him. And I think he spoke in the episode about how at one stage someone actually said to him, the mantle of your father has been passed on to you. And for him, he had a real reaction to that. And he was like, fuck, no, I don't want this.
Yeah, he said, remember, the only reason I was invited to speak, the only reason I was where I was because I was my father's son. It had nothing to do with merit, nothing to do with strength. But then he felt that he was recognized as eventually being a better speaker than his father and, more active than his father, etc. But that's not how he got there. He got there simply because he was the son of Francis Schaeffer, evangelical writer and superstar.
Well, that's right. And he was speaking on the world stage, flying around in Jerry Falwell's jet. At the time, he was 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, for a 4 or 5 year period. I mean, you don't really have the experience at that age to be able to speak on a world stage with authority just through your own gifts and talents, do you? So you have to have that passed on, and something that Penties and evangelicals are brilliant at is going, don't worry about how old they are, or don't worry about their experience. They're my child, or they're my relation, or just trust me. The old just trust me.
That's right. Now, biblically, the mantle was passed from the king to the son, not the
Yep.
prophetic mantle, right? So let's make that clear. It was the kingship that was handed on from father to son. And you could argue, oh, well, the tribe of the Levites, that, priestly role was handed on from father to son, 100%. You could argue that. But I just want to stress that the idea of a prophetic mantle, when we look at like Elijah to Elisha and these kinds of people, they weren't related. All right. So that the prophetic one is not handed from father to son. But I want to really stress again, it's back to that hereditary title. It's an ancient form of government where it's just given to the son because the son is the son. And there's no such thing in the New Testament. We don't see any of that. Jesus didn't have his own kids. The apostles and the prophets, evangelists, all these kinds of things. We don't read anything in the Bible about mantles being handed on from father to son or mother to daughter or anything like that.
I mean, you could argue from their perspective, and even if you look at today's royals, that they are groomed from birth. And I'm sure that all the royals of days gone by and any of these dictatorships that are happening in history and now, that they're groomed from the day that they're born to take up that role. So from their perspective, they're like, well, this person will definitely be the best person for it because we've actually trained them in how to respond.
They become like a ruling class within the church, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely they do. It is frightening.
So American evangelicalism is ridiculously nepotistic. All right. So we see Jerry Falwell Sr. handing everything on to Jerry Falwell Jr. And then, of course, all the scandals and everything that have happened in there. We see Billy Graham Evangelistic Association handed on to Franklin Graham. And we could list off a whole heap. It is the way that it's done in America. Now, I like what Frank Schaeffer said. Do you remember? He said, if you did this in business in America, you would go to jail. The way that they just hand everything on from father to son and the rife nepotism, you would go to jail because it's just not allowed. And I don't know if you've seen that show, The Righteous Gemstones, which is a TV show on HBO in the US, but it's on Foxtel and Binge here in Australia on those streaming services. That is a prime example of everything that we are talking about. So if you want to go and have a look, please pop over to those channels, watch The Righteous Gemstones, and you're going to see exactly what we are talking about when we talk about American evangelicalism and nepotism.
And look, you do look at it and go, oh, God, this is far-fetched. But reflect on it. And, of course, there's a little bit of drama in it. But it's exactly what happens. And I think the theme of that show is exactly what happens. Sadly, I mean, I remember Frank saying that in terms of Billy Graham, he thought Billy Graham was a very sincere person. But Franklin Graham, he's picked up the mantle and is insincere and far right. And Frank goes as far as saying that these mobs are criminal enterprises. Remember he said that?
That's exactly what he said, yeah. Well, that's the thing I think about The Righteous Gemstones. When you watch The Righteous Gemstones, you see the father's character, John Goodman's character, is actually quite sincere.
Yep.
And he's often face-palming at his kids' behaviour. And we'll come back to this a little bit later because there's one case in particular in Australia where I know that the senior pastor of the church is just face-palming at what his kids are actually up to. Brian, before we get into what we're about to talk about, I just want to say to those that are listening, hold your lawyers, okay? We are making no accusation of any illegal actions, okay? So we are not in any way saying that anyone's done anything illegal that's not already on public record, etc. But we are asking, is this ethical and is this right? And from a church perspective, even more so, shouldn't the standard be even higher?
You would think so, wouldn't you? And look, I think we're going to talk through Australian examples primarily, but I'm sure that you could lift these in your local community, your country, wherever you may be listening from. And I'm sure that there are thousands of examples of this very same thing. And if you are listening from outside of Australia, you can Google these and verify these stories that we are going to be telling. The names won't be changed to protect the innocent because we'll use their actual names because that is
This is all public record, and most of this has come from Wikipedia, which is written by their fans. I mean, I don't know if you went and had a look at the articles. In fact, you did. I know you did. But when you look at the articles, they're puff pieces really about just the wonderfulness of these people and these churches, which again demonstrates what I was trying to say at the very beginning. They don't even think there's anything wrong with this. Otherwise, they wouldn't be broadcasting it like they do.
No, that's right. But it doesn't take long to, I mean, you look back on the Righteous Gemstones and sure, that's a bit theatrical, but the exact same thing happens in these families that they have obscene wealth. I mean, you see it more in those mega pastors in the States in flying around their private jets and have their enormous mansions. But these same people talk about justice and they talk about protecting and looking after the widows and all of that, but you don't go as far as actually sharing your goods because God's actually given you those, especially for you because you're so faithful.
Oh, that's right. When Jesus said to the rich young ruler, sell everything you have, he was talking to him. He wasn't talking to us.
Oh, no, absolutely not. And, the old through the eye of a needle, yes. Easier to get a camel. No, don't worry about that.
Oh, yeah. Have you heard the story? Oh, there was actually a gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle, and you had to actually take everything off your camel and put the camel through the gate. And it's all bullshit. That gate never existed. They used to just go in through the gate, And so the idea was, they said, if you take everything off the camel, go through the eye of the needle, then put everything back on the camel. In other words, give it all up, come to Christ, but then you can start rebuilding it again. Bullshit. That's just not there.
I think you've got a lack of faith, and I think you'll be held to account for this.
I don't know, man. I was pretty passionate then. I think it sounded like I had a lot of faith.
Yeah, I think so. But, this happens all through, and, it's not what this episode's about, but it's definitely sits in there behind the scenes that people misinterpret and interpret any of those ancient scriptures or words in a way which benefits themselves and justifies their behaviour.
And suits themselves, indeed. Well, let's start with the Evans clan. So they are a big Australian Christian Churches Assemblies of God family from South Australia. So you've probably heard of the Evans clan. I'm going to read some stuff. As I said, most of this comes from Wikipedia. And Brian, you just stop me whenever you want to talk about anything. But let's start with Andrew Evans. He was born to missionary parents, Tom and Stella Evans, and he's the older brother of Pastor Fred Evans, right? So even at that generation, we're already starting to see very strong Assemblies of God presence and very much in the family. He studied for Christian ministry at the Assemblies of God Bible College, now known as, I don't know, how do you say this, Alpha Crucis?
I think it's Alpha Crucis or something like that, yeah.
He was ordained for ministry in 1963, served as a missionary with the AOG World Missions, and then he became the senior pastor in 1970 of Clemzig. Is that how you say this, in Adelaide?
It's in Adelaide. Does it really matter?
Yes, okay. So first pastor, I think it's Clemzig Assembly of God, and then that became known as Paradise AOG. So some of you are going to know that one, right? Now called Influences Church, which sounds like, which sounds like it's the church. We're not trying to get the movie stars and pop stars. We're now trying to get all the YouTubers into I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. What a fucking stupid name for a church. Influences Church.
Isn't it? I'm loving all these different names of churches, how they're rebranding away from Assemblies of God and Christian City and whatever. They think they're being relevant. That's the funny thing. Like when you sit from the outside and you look at them and go, oh, and you say to your friends, it's obviously going to be a lot more palatable to go, where are you going this weekend? I'm going to Influences, or I'm going to Stairway. I mean, fuck off.
Planet Shakers. There's a humble name. Global Senior Interim Pastor. Fucking yes. Indeed. Anyway, Influences Church. Come on. Great name. I mean, so bad. I mean, Bobby and Brian must just be jealous. Influences Church. Anyway, so in 1977, he became the national superintendent of the Assemblies of God. This is Andrew Evans, and he held that position for 20 years. So you don't get any higher than that. So one of the biggest churches in Australia, true to, like Rome was the biggest church. So the Roman head became the Pope. So too, these guys were huge, and he became the head of that.
Okay, can you remember the I'm sure you do, basically the fame and glory that surrounded Andrew Evans when we were in Great Big AOG? I mean, that was in his prime, in his probably last 5 to 10 years of being superintendent, but he would come and speak. He was often spoken about. He was really seen as someone who did have a great deal of power and influence.
Indeed, indeed. Now, there was a guy named Danny Guglielmucci. That's how you say it properly, apparently. I heard him once correct us, but he was known as Danny Guglielmucci. Do you remember him? Now, he was Evans's assistant pastor for a very long time in Paradise AOG, while Evans's own boys, Ashley and Russell, were young. So Guglielmucci, remember Go Chok Tong, right? So Guglielmucci is the two I see because, Ash and Russ are too young. But they eventually became youth pastors and youth leaders, right? So they were stepped into that role. Now, I want to tell a bit of a story, and this comes firsthand. So I was at a Youth Alive conference in the 90s, and Danny Guglielmucci stood up and he gave us a sermon, but before he did the sermon, he started to talk about this thing that he called jobs for the boys. Yeah. And he stood up there and he said, people look at me having made Ashley and Russell Evans youth pastors in the church, and they think, oh, he's just given jobs for the boys because of Andrew Evans. And he stood up there and he just mocked anyone that would dare consider or accuse him of just feathering the nest for his boss's own boys. And it was kind of like, that I fear thou dost protest too much, because it's like, that's exactly what you've done. You know that if you give amazing jobs to these guys, you're going to find favor with your boss, and it's going to be a good thing for you. So I can remember him standing there at this Youth Alive conference. It was the Ramada Hotel up in the Gold Coast in Surfers Paradise. And he sat there and told us all about people around saying, oh, you're just giving jobs to the boys, blah, blah, blah. And even at the time I was like, but I think you did.
This happened all the time in terms of from the pulpit. You heard, certainly the best method of defense was offense, and they would often go on the offensive and often go and try and discredit a theory or a belief rather than defending their own. So they would really attack. So that's completely within character.
Yeah, for sure. So Paradise was huge. It was a really big church. They started Youth Alive South Australia, and the Evans boys, right? This is Ashley and Russell, not to be confused with cousin David, who was a singer. They were high profile in that. And I assume that they ran that at some stage. Now, I tried to do my research, and I can't say that 100%, but I'm 99% sure. But nevertheless, I can't say 100% that the Evans boys were at the helm, but I'm pretty sure.
Was this around the stage they took it back from the Apostolics?
Yeah, right. They took it back from the Apostolics. Indeed. No, I don't think they needed to, because they never fucking let it go.
No.
So Southside Christian Church was established in 1994. That was like a satellite church of Paradise, and Danny Guglielmucci took off and pastored that. Then in 1997, the contemporary worship music band Planet Shakers was created out of the first Planet Shakers conference, right? So in Hillsong-esque style, right? Oh, look, Hillsong have a conference called Hillsong. We're going to start our own, call it Planet Shakers. And eventually, we're even going to name our church after our conference. It's just like fucking predictable. But anyway.
But it's, it's a proven recipe that works, isn't it? And for Planet Shakers, it worked too. I mean, they went huge. I mean, they're nothing like Hillsong, I don't think. I mean, they've got a bit of fame and adoration.
Well, they want to be.
Yeah, they want to be. But they've got a bit of fame and adoration in Australia, but I'm not sure that they necessarily went global like Hillsong. Certainly didn't go as big as Hillsong, but they tried, and bless them.
Yeah, bless them. #blessed.
Blessed be.
So Here we go, though. Listen to this. In 2000, Andrew Evans' youngest son, Ashley, and his wife, Jane, took over as senior pastors at Paradise. So in that Singapore-style model, they weren't old enough, so Danny Goog had it. But then when they became old enough, Andrew Evans stood down and gave the entire church, all the assets, everything that's controlled by the senior pastor, right, and by the board, etc., all fell to the hands of Ashley and his wife. And then the Planet Shakers youth movement grew in this. So we've still got Russell is still involved very strongly in there. And as we said, it's now known as the Influencers Church in an attempt to attract YouTubers.
When you say, all of those assets and buildings and things like that are handed over, surely that belongs to the people, to the congregation, wouldn't you think?
Well, on paper it does. On paper it 100% does. And so again, we're not claiming anybody doing anything illegal here. But you and I know that a lot of these boards in these churches are actually stacked with people who are in full support of the dynasty. So you're not going to put anybody in there that's going to turn around and threaten that. So yes, it's not owned by Andrew Evans, it's not owned by Ashley and Russell Evans, etc., but they have control over this as the senior pastors of these churches.
Sorry, I baited you with that one. But I got the answer I wanted, so it was good. It's exactly...
Yeah, no, it's important to point out because that way we keep the lawyers at bay. Now, in 2004, Russell and his wife, Sam, I'm guessing that's Samantha. They're not that inclusive.
Not Samuel.
No, moved to Melbourne to form the Planet Shakers Church. So now what we've got is we've got the head of the AOG, superintendent of the AOG for a very long time. He eventually stands down. Now his two boys are running two of the largest, most powerful churches, not only in the Australian Christian churches, but also in Australia.
I do remember when it moved into Melbourne, it made waves. And I remember there being lots of conversation around it. And they took over a big conference centre from memory. So very, very much like a Hillsong-esque type model. And I remember people just gushing about this place. It was the new latest and greatest. I don't know if it still exists. I'm sure it does.
Yeah, it's still rocking. They've got multi-campuses, of course.
Of
That's
good.
what you do. And they call themselves like Planet Shakers International and Influencers Church International, and they've all got multi-campuses. So there's these, they want to be Hillsong. They want to break away and be super huge, but they're still staying within the AOG, but they're pretending like they're separate. It's just fucking weird.
They're influencers, though.
Well, they are influencers, indeed. Yes. Now, here's the thing. I want to stress. We have a problem, okay? Our first little example of this, some of the most powerful, strongest families and churches, here we have nepotism, all right? So this is serious, Mum, nepotism.
Mm.
Do you want to talk to us about what happened after that with the Guglielmuccis?
I'm just going to say the Googs, just because my accent isn't great. My Italian, the only Italian word I remember from high school was fungul. That's about it. And I'm sorry for offending any Italian listeners.
Fungul.
And that's
The Sopranos.
I did love The Sopranos, but do you remember they actually said that in Greece? Remember, Greece was a PG, and because they probably didn't think that anyone would have understood it, it's a fungul in there.
Yeah, but when you said Greece, then I was going to say, no, that's Pusti Malaka, but you meant the movie.
I did. So back to the Googs. So Danny, we've spoken about Danny, but in 2006, the Googs, Southside Christian Church, became Edge Church. Not just Edge Church, but Edge Church International.
Well, there you go. See, there it is. Everything that I just said. Change the name. And they don't change the name because they're trying to distance themselves from bullshit. They change the name because they're trying to be cool and hip.
It's marketing. Like all of these big churches these days have a marcoms department. They're very good at it. Like if we've reflected on this before. If you have a look at Pentecostal churches, they are the ultimate marketing machines, and their comms are very slick, very, very slick, have some great little snippets and clips, and they're very emotive, very, very good.
Indeed. And what did El Hardy say? No one uses social media like the Penties.
That's right. Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I don't follow any Penty churches on social media, but I certainly have seen clips. And I've seen parodies of those clips, which are very funny. Danny's son, Michael. Now, he became pastor at Russell Evans's church, Planet Shakers. What's happening here?
Hello, jobs for the boys. See, remember, Danny gave positions to his boss's boys. Now what happens here? Years later...
I think it's purely coincidental.
Jobs for the boys.
No, coincidental.
Payback.
I don't know what you're inferring. I mean, this is ridiculous. You're drawing ridiculous conclusions here.
So the Evans boy gave the Guglielmucci boy a job. Now, how do we define nepotism again? Let me just go back up here and have a look. The practice amongst those with power or influence of favouring relatives or friends, especially by giving them jobs.
You're a cynic. You're a cynic. With good reason as we go on. So it was reported in 2008 that Michael Gug, pastor of the church and former bass player in Planet Shakers band.
In Hillsong, they weren't connected.
No. He had fraudulently claimed that he was dying of cancer.
I'm fraudulently upset by that.
I am too. I remember this one well. I was out of the fold, and I remember watching this from afar, and I remember there was lots and lots of prayer chains happening. My mum was still very involved and still is very involved in the evangelical scene, and lots of prayer chains for Danny. For Michael. Because
he was the one, by the way, I just want to quickly point out that he was the one that Fiona Newton told him, oh, don't set up a youth group with all these poor kids because they can't tithe.
Yes, that's correct.
That was Michael Guglielmucci.
The Gugster.
The soprano.
At this time, he wrote Healer, a song of encouragement for believers who were suffering from cancer, for the album Saviour of the World. And now this was released in 2007.
Oh, praise the Lord. I'm fraudulently touched by this.
I think I'm genuinely feel sick from this. The Gug, he performed the song regularly over a 2-year period, often with oxygen tubes up his nose.
Fraudulently up his nose.
Oh, no, they were genuinely up his nose. And during this time, he received money from supporters who believed his illness was real.
So you're saying here that he was not sick. He told everybody he was sick. He was releasing almost Christmas songs basically about his sickness. He's got tubes up his nose and oxygen bottles, but it was all fake.
Yeah. And not only this, but again, we see Planet Shakers and Hillsong do a little bit of a collab here, because that track, Healer, was added to their Hillsong's album, This Is Our God, scandalously later removed.
Oh, praise the Lord. Fraudulently removed.
No, it was genuinely removed. But the Gugster, he later explained his actions. His actions of believing that he had cancer, well, not believing, fraudulently deceiving everyone that he had cancer. What was it from? A long-term porn addiction.
Sorry, I don't understand that. So you're saying that instead of saying, oh, look, I was overwhelmed, I was pushed to succeed and there was too much pressure on me, he actually said, oh, it's because I'm into porn.
Yes, it's an obvious link. I mean, can't you see it?
No.
Either can I. The old Gugster was full of shit. And I stand by that because it was proven. So representatives of the church with who the Gug had affiliations told the press they were totally unaware of this situation. They weren't part of this scam. And in an email sent to Hillsong members, the church's general manager, George
Afghanistani.
Yeah, I don't even know how to pronounce that one, but George Agadajani said the news was even a shock to the Gug's own family. But I do remember, in defence of his father, Danny, I do remember when he came out to speak about this at that time, he did look genuinely shocked. He looked like he was genuinely hurting and destroyed by what his son had done. I mean, it was messed up. It wasn't getting up on stage once at during a sermon and going, "Oh, guys, I've got cancer, pray for me." I mean, this was a scam that went on for a couple of years. It raked in a fuckload of money because you had to support Michael and, pray for him and heal, but also give him a little bit of a financial boost at the time.
Oxygen bottles aren't free.
They're not free, but I do wonder what was actually in those bottles. I think it was an early form of vaping. This was back in like 2007, but there was something going up his nose, and it certainly wasn't oxygen.
Yeah, for the sake of lawyers, we just want to stress that was a joke.
So, his whole family was shocked, old Googs. So what did they do at that time? They stripped him of all his credentials as a minister. That was the Australian Christian churches at the time, stripped him. And they promised that all money donated by listeners inspired by that song would be returned to them or donated to charity. Now, what charity do you think that might have gone to, given that churches have charity status?
Well, I reckon it might have been something to do with Edge Church International.
Yeah, like quite possibly.
Christian churches.
It wouldn't be that hard to actually return the money to people, because generally you have to put your details when you donate. So
but not necessarily, Brian, because you think about it, there'd be those mauve-coloured bags that are handed around in the services, and people would just be sticking cash in.
I think it'd be like my old mate who was asking for 44-gallon drums to be filled with cash. I reckon that would have been happening. But yeah, look, either way, whatever. Like, he was stripped. He was disgraced. The family was disgraced, weren't they?
They were. And so that should have been the end of him, right? Really, from if that had happened in inverted commas real world, then that would be the end of someone. They're disgraced, they're out, they're gone. Go and work at Macca's, get a job at Coles New World or whatever it is, because he probably doesn't have a lot of options.
Hang on.
What?
Are you saying it wasn't the end of him?
I don't know. This is your story.
Oh my God. I can't believe that you're inferring that it wasn't the end of him.
It should have been, right?
Wait, there's more.
Hi, I'm Stephen.
And I'm Celine from the Cult Hackers podcast.
So I'm a former member of a high control group, otherwise known as a cult, who left when I was about 30. That's about the time my daughter was born. That's you, Celine.
We explore what it's like to be in a cult and leave one. We interview former members and leading cult experts. And we also talk about the long journey of making sense of the world afterwards.
Yeah, that's a journey that you've witnessed and helped me with.
I'm a media graduate interested in the place cults have in our society.
And I'm an organisational psychologist these days with an interest in leadership and who also studies cults and cultic groups.
There's a new episode every week where we look at cults from every angle and attempt to crack the cult code.
So search for Cult Hackers on your favourite podcast app and catch up with us every Saturday.
Are you doubting your religious beliefs? Having questions about changing or leaving your faith? Well, you're not alone, and Recovering from Religion is here to help.
Learning how to live after questions, doubts, and changing your religious beliefs is a journey. The people at Recovering from Religion are intimately familiar with this path and are there to help you cross that bridge.
Their passion is connecting others with support, resources, community, and most of all, hope. They offer both peer and professional support.
Find out more by visiting recoveringfromreligion.org or find the links in our show notes.
Fast forward a few years to 2014, and Edge Church, or should we say Edge Church International, saw a major transition in leadership from Pastor Danny Goog as the founding pastor to its current lead pastor, Jonathan Fontanorosa, if that is how you say his name.
Sounds like a kind of pizza. I've got nothing against Italians, all right? But is that an Italian name? Is that an Italian guy giving the church to another Italian guy?
I think it's there's a Calabrian link here.
Fontanorosa.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's call him Johnny Font.
Johnny Font.
Johnny
Hey,
Font.
it's Johnny Font. What you doing? Vafangul.
Are you talking to me? So Danny Googs gives this to Johnny Font. And then...
But because he can't give it to his son. Let's make that clear. You cannot be giving the church now to the disgraced, oxygen-wearing, cancer-lying, fraudulent son.
No, you can't.
Even your own AOG, ACC, they're not going to put up with that. We know that.
No, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
Fast forward again, a few more years. So Guglielmucci, or the Googs, and his wife of 20 years, Amanda, this is in 2021.
This is Michael.
Oh, sorry, this is Michael.
Yeah.
This is Michael. This is Mr. Fakey. Registered Lighthouse City Mission Incorporated. It's incorporated, of course, as a charity helping the financially disadvantaged, people with chronic illness, migrants, refugees, and the general community in Australia.
Now, are they real chronic illnesses that he's supporting people, or you just have to say you've got one?
They can be fraudulent ones.
Can
No, they'll support fraudulent ones. But, you know, any gifts or money or any offerings taken will be returned to people. Or
Sure. It's all been returned, but now we're going to start taking them again.
There's a mansion in heaven, so it's fine. And I can tell you what money it was built with.
Can I just say something here before you go on?
No.
Okay.
Okay, go.
People are going to listen to this, right? People that are still in the fold and saying, these guys are just being so negative and they're just being, so against the work of the Lord, etc. Fuck off. All right, because this is for real. This is real money, real people, real lives, and this is something straight out of HBO's acclaimed series, The Righteous Gemstones.
It totally is. I mean, if I transfer it into my everyday life, in the organisation I worked for, if my CEO brought in her son or her husband or someone and said, oh, you know what, I'm going to step down and I'm going to pass on the running of this mid-sized business to them, there would be an uproar. There would be an absolute uproar because they don't have the skills to run it. They don't have the background nor the qualifications. But we accept that. We accept it within the Penty and evangelical circles.
Mm.
So here we have, we've got Michael and Amanda. They've set up Lighthouse City Mission Incorporated. Don't forget it's incorporated. That makes it a little bit more legitimate. Their godly instructions included that he and his spouse, or Team Goog, should they resign their roles at his father Danny's church, Edge Church International, and sell their home and relocate to Port Adelaide.
Now, that came from the NewYorkPost.com, right? So what we're saying there is that he got godly instructions, wherever the godly instructions came from, which means that they had to sell everything. Didn't mean they have to give the money away. They just sell everything, relocate. But what's really important is they resigned their roles at their father's church, at Danny Goog's church. Resign their roles. This is in 2021. So what does that mean, Brian?
That means that they were back employed to lead the fold who they'd fraudulently deceived. Well, not they. He had several years back.
So his dad had basically, after all that bullshit, hired him back onto staff at the Edge Church.
Yeah, well, he'd obviously dealt with his porn addiction at that time, so he'd have no temptation to then lead people astray with his fraudulent claims.
Like setting up another charity. So let me go back and look at nepotism again. What's that definition? The practice among those with power or influence of favouring relatives or friends, especially by giving them jobs. So because he'd lost his gig at Planet Shakers, Danny Goog gave his son a job at his church again, at Edge Church. Fuck me.
Yeah, well, you've got to look after your kids, get them back in the family business. It's a family business, isn't it?
Jobs for the boys. Again, jobs for the boys. I wonder if he stood up at the Youth Alive conference that year and said, oh, people are saying jobs for the boys. I gave my son a job back, jobs for the boys. I bet you he didn't say it that fucking year.
Well, it wasn't just jobs for the boys. It was jobs for both Michael and Amanda. So it was jobs for the boys and the
girls. Yeah, that's right. Team Goog. Jobs for Team Goog.
That's right, the old Googs. Now, look, we say all this not to completely bag these people out and go, they're a bunch of scammers, they're absolutely deceitful people. This is to point out the absurdity of what happens also, the absolute absurdity. And to a degree, you know, we really need to point that out. I mean, this stuff doesn't happen by coincidence.
Yeah, and this is all public record, all right? So please go and do a Google search on that. So that's the first big...
Don't you mean a Guglielmucci search?
Yeah, do a Gulli search. So that's one of the big families, right? That's the Evanses, and also, you know, his Go Chok Tong, his 2IC, the Guglielmuccis, right? So that's all that South Australian scandal. My own experience at the revival centres was Lloyd Longfield, who was the head pastor of the revival centre. His son was a pastor in the main Melbourne revival centre until he had a parting away with his fathers and went off and joined the AOG in the early 80s or in the mid 80s. Now, the whole kit and caboodle, when Lloyd retired, was all handed on to Lloyd's second son, Simon. So there's another huge empire, Pentecostal empire, which was given from father. One son was being set up. That son didn't work out, so it was given to the next son, a la North Korea. And what we saw in Great Big AOG, Brian, do you remember? When we first got there, the senior pastor, he had faced nepotism with the founding family of Great Big AOG. So he hadn't been part of that founding family. And somehow he found himself in that role of senior pastor. But when we first got there, do you remember? His brother-in-law, so senior pastor's brother-in-law was the assistant pastor.
Yep.
And the senior pastor's son was the youth pastor.
Yep.
And then when the brother-in-law left, the senior pastor's son became the assistant pastor.
He did.
So that was full. I mean, this is just anecdotally, this is our experience both in the Revival Centre and also in Great Big AOG. Now, what happened in Great Big AOG is senior pastor didn't give his son the whole shebang and gave it to another pastor instead, who, by the way, looked just like his son.
He did.
But his son took on another mega church in another state. So jobs for the boys, right?
Oh.
He didn't give it to his own son, but his own son got a job in, you know, sort of Guglielmucci style off somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Like it was, again, but, you know, when I think about this, I mean, remember back in season 1, our interview with Anthony Van Brown, that he spoke about when his world fell apart. The question for him was, I have done this all my life. I'm an evangelist. I'm pastor type roles that he had fulfilled. He was like, what else can I do? I was at Centrelink and I was saying to the people at Centrelink or whatever it was at the time, this is all I've done all my life. I've got no idea what I can do. So it's like these guys protect themselves so they don't have to fall out into the real world again or ever, because a lot of them have never actually had a job outside the church, because what else could they do? I mean, a lot of these skills aren't that transferable.
I mean, that's what I found. When I left the ministry, I had to basically retrain. And luckily I was quite young. I was only just about to turn 30. So yeah, but I totally understand that. So I'm going to share this one. Now, there's a church in the suburbs of Melbourne in a place called Dingley Village, and it's called Echo Church. Now, I've just chosen this randomly, and what I mean by that is you're going to see this in a lot of other churches, but here's one that we can just demonstrate. It's not just these big empires, it's also these small churches. Now, this church used to be known as Harvest Christian Life Centre, and it was started by a guy named Tom Rawls. Do you remember Tom Rawls?
I do remember Tom Rawls.
Yep, he was instrumental also in Church of the Rock with Dave and Rosanna Palmer and connected to all that. Very much big in the Victorian Assembly of God. Now, when he left to go to Thailand as a missionary, this is Tom Rawls, his kids and family were all too young, so he took them all with him. So he had no one to give it to. But he gave it to a guy named Mike Smith, Pastor Mike Smith. And so Mike Smith took over Harvest Christian Life Centre, which I think used to be in Moorabbin.
Okay.
And then, or maybe it was always in Dingley, I'm not sure. But Mike Smith eventually renamed the church Destiny Church, as you do, right?
God,
because it can't be called Harvest anymore. It sounds too much like a type of bread. So now it has to be called Destiny Church. But here we go. You ready? So Smith had that church from when Tom Rawls gave it to him sometime in the 90s. But in 2018, he handed the church to his daughter and son-in-law, Justin and Lee Box. Now, I don't know if he didn't have a son, but he gave it to his daughter. And it seems to me that sexism trumps nepotism here, because he didn't just give it to his daughter, he gave it to the son-in-law. So the son-in-law becomes the senior pastor, but it's still in the family, if you know what I mean.
Mm.
And then in 2019, what did Justin and Lee do? Change the name of the church to Echo Church.
Echo.
Church.
Yeah, that's right. Echo Chamber.
Echo Chamber. Yes, Echo Chamber Church. By the way, they're very strongly affiliated with Bethel, not just the Australian Christian churches. So this is Echo Church, right? So interestingly, the worship leader's name, this is all on their website, all right? I didn't make this up. Interestingly, the worship leader's name is Mitchell Smith. Remember Mike Smith?
Smith's a common.
Yeah, no. It's true. Now, I'm not sure if there's any relation. And in true journalistic fashion, I emailed them and said, is Mitchell Smith related to Mike Smith? But they didn't reply.
Oh, I wonder why.
Yeah, so I can actually say, we reached out to the blah, 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 but there was no reply, just like on the news. Now, if someone could find out and put this in the Facebook group, that would be wonderful. Is Mitchell Smith related to Justin and Lee Box? But he's the worship leader, which is a big deal in these kind of churches. They are multi-campus, I think, as well. I think that they possibly Echo Church, international, national. I'm not sure. Nevertheless, much smaller situation here, but it's another church. Control of all the assets and all the money and all that kind of stuff is handed on to the family again. Dun, 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 dun.
I think there's a theme.
There is a theme. And they don't care. They don't think that they're doing anything wrong, right? Now, if you were working at a big multinational or you were working at a government department, you would be sacked for doing this.
Yeah, but you know why? It's biblical. It's passing the mantle,
which is not biblical. We've already said that precedent, right? It's just hereditary title, kings and queens and princes and princesses.
Don't you know how to twist scripture?
Not anymore. Once I could.
I do. There's a great song by a Christian band called the Rockin' Rabbis that came out of Perth, and I knew the singer Owen Beck through one of my brothers, and they had this great song called "I'm Into Twisted Scripture," and it's really good. Just Google the song. It's a fun song. The Rockin' Rabbis are a fun band to listen to.
Yeah, you actually put me onto that song back in the day.
Yeah,
wasn't it? Oh man, do twisted scripture or something like that. That's how it went on, didn't it?
It was
very tismish. I'm
yes.
into tism again these days. This is serious, Mum. Yeah, nepotism.
Yeah.
All right, now here comes our favourite one, and I'm going to hand this one over to you because this is our favourite of all easy targets. Because this one is just a prime demonstration of, like, we've shown you this is pretty full on, right? But now when we get to this church, nepotism goes to a whole new level.
Yeah, and look, we don't mean to single this church out, except for we mean to single this church out because it's really easy because they're in the bloody news all the time, and we know this. And again, all of this is on the public record. That'll be Hillsong. So where did Hillsong start? It all started with Frank Houston. Now, Frank was born in Wanganui, and I can tell you, I've been to Wanganui. Oh, brew, it's a suck place. I loved Wanganui. It was a beautiful little town up in the north of the North Island. So Frank, he was with the Salvos. Not long after turning 18, he married Hazel. They had 5 kids, including our favourite Houston Brian. The couple transferred then to the Bappos and later to AOG in New Zealand. Went on through New Zealand, through to, 1965 to 71, he served as the superintendent of the AOG in New Zealand. And in 77, they moved to Australia. So Hazel and Frank moved to Australia and founded the Sydney Christian Life Centre in Double Bay.
Possibly fleeing accusations of sexual abuse, by the way.
Yeah, that's right, because they happened in the 60s and, as we know, were found to be true. So they're not just allegations. So they weren't affiliated with any denomination. then became the Assemblies of God, affiliated with the Assemblies of God Church, and it moved to Darlinghurst and into a warehouse, very penty, move into a warehouse with a 600-seat auditorium, a Bible college and creative arts college, and lots of other stuff, which then continues today. So Houston by then had a problem, but he was known as the bishop, and not an official title, but a humorous reference to mainstream churches. So they're taking the piss out of mainstream churches.
Someone's bishop is actually a euphemism for your penis. So here's this sexual predator whose nickname in the church is Penis, the penis.
Yeah, pretty sickening, isn't it? So he's a bent unit. He was involved in over 20 Christian life centres being opened through New South Wales and overseas. So even back then, like, Frank was planting away. Like, this hasn't just been a Brian thing. Like, this thing was expanding back then. And Frank served as pastor of his church for more than 20 years and other positions within the AOG. 1999, after consultation amongst senior pastoral staff of the church and the staff of Hills Christian Life Centre, a daughter church pastored by Brian at this time, the churches were merged to become Hillsong. So 1999, Hillsong was born.
So basically he had given his jobs, jobs for the boys. His son had a gig in the churches, and then he was sent out to do others, and then eventually he started his own. So it was, this sort of dynasty thing was already starting back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was being handed over to Brian just wasn't, one little church. I mean, we've spoken about this. There was more than 20 churches already been planted around Australia or in New South Wales and overseas. So the empire was already there. It had strong foundations. I'm going to hand to you to talk a little bit about Brian.
Okay, well, Brian came over with his dad and was involved in the church, and obviously had a leadership role. Eventually, he took over everything, and so he became the head of the Hills Christian Life Centre and and all those affiliated churches. But they were part of the Assemblies of God, and so in 1997, and I remember this, Houston was elected the president of the Assemblies of God in Australia, which is now the Australian Christian Churches, at the retirement of Andrew Evans. So this is another dynasty-ish family that's basically taken control of the AOG. And then Houston eventually, as we know, becomes head of this group called Hillsong, and they break away from the AOG. So Houston, this is Brian Houston, is now the executive producer of Hillsong Music Australia. And I dare say, I'm not saying this is for sure, but I dare say he's probably drawing some sort of massive wage for that and royalties, etc. In September 2018, they broke away from the Australian Christian Churches, and now they became, Hillsong as we know them today. So Brian is the global senior pastor, or the senior global pastor of Hillsong, and as we record this, he stepped down from that to face the charges against his dad. Now, at the same time, though, and here's where it's this whole family business thing, he's got his wife Bobby, and so it's Brian and Bobby. She's the global senior pastor. She hasn't stood down at the moment. She runs the weekly women's ministry at Hillsong. She started the Colour Your World conference. She's also involved in the Colour Sisterhood, which is a foundation set up by Hillsong through Hillsong Women and the women's ministry of the church, etc. So she's super involved there as well. So husband and wife, massively tied into this and hold a lot of power. But what happens next, Brian?
Oh, surely that's where it stops. Surely it's just with Brian and Barbie.
Well, it wouldn't be jobs for the boys.
No. I mean, you wouldn't think that Joel Houston was also a co-pastor at Hillsong New York, for example.
So this is who's Joel Houston?
Joel is a son.
Okay.
So he, between 2010 and 2017, was the co-pastor. So I love how it's not an assistant pastor now, it's a co-pastor. So it's more of a more collaborative, isn't it?
So maybe not old enough to be taking over yet, but old enough to be given a job.
Yes. However, he still has a huge job, which is the head of Christian worship band, Hillsong United. So he sings, plays guitar, writes songs for them. And in 2008, he became the creative director at Hillsong Church. So, he did have a gig there before he went to Hillsong in New York as well.
Hey, can I just say that the creative think about something like Hillsong where music and performance is everything. To be the creative director of that church is no small role.
That's massive.
Huge.
That's massive.
Yeah.
But, he was anointed. Daughter, Laura Toggs, she's a pioneer of young and free.
She got, sorry, I just wanted to say, Laura Toggs, she got a child named Dickie?
I hope so.
Dickie Toggs.
And just for our listeners that aren't familiar with the swimmers called Speedos, we call them Dickie Togs in Australia, in some parts of Australia.
So she's obviously married someone else. That's why she's not Laura Houston.
Yeah, I don't think she's tried to disassociate herself from the family, that's for sure. So together with her family, well, her husband, Peter, they pastor the youth ministry of Hillsong Church. God.
Small gig.
But yeah, according to the website, she's a visionary. So much
this is
like
their
her
own
father.
website, by the way. This comes straight from Hillsong.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
She's a
it's
visionary.
not.
Yeah, just like her father, Pastor Brian Houston. That's what it actually said.
Yeah, that's right. So what they're doing is putting some preparatory groundwork in for handing over some other stuff. But she also has the Secret Garden TV.
Now, can I stop you there?
No.
Because the secret garden is a euphemism for a woman's vagina. I have not made this up. So we've got the bishop, grandpa, and now she is pioneering the Secret Garden TV.
This is ridiculous.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Do they know what they're doing here, or is this purely just some sort of Jungian, Freudian thing?
It's Freudian.
Mm.
I do love Freud. So I do think it's Freudian. They surely their marketing people aren't very bright, are they?
Keep reading, because remember, this is a secret garden. Keep reading what it actually says about this, or what you're going to do with your secret garden. Go on.
Yeah, it's not great. A space designed to reach and inspire young women by compelling them to dig deeper into the things that consume their hearts.
So dig deeper, ladies. Now, when I first read that, I thought dig deeper into your wallet, but now I think it's maybe something about digging deeper into the secret garden.
It's not good. But, what are they essentially doing?
Jobs for the boys.
They're leaning in.
They are. They're leaning in financially, but also both these two kids have very high-ranking, powerful jobs. I would love to know what their credentials were besides going to the actual Hillsong Bible College. What are their credentials I doubt they're there, but anyway.
Oh, but wait, there's more.
Oh, come on. Steak knives, come on.
Here's the steak knives. Another son, Ben Houston. So Ben is married to Lucille, and together they're the global online lead pastors of Hillsong Church, which I'm sure during COVID saw a massive expansion.
They saw millions of hits, hundreds of millions of hits, I think. So this is no small role either.
No, this is massive. What are they? They are passionate about God and the church and have a real heart to see people find hope, life, and answers in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and also really, really keen to see Dad give jobs for the boys.
Yes, it's all racked and stacked, isn't it? None of the kids have had to go and work outside of the family business.
Not for very long, anyway.
No. But very recently, what's Brian done? He's announced that Ben and his daughter-in-law would be pursuing their dream of starting Hillsong LA in the OC area sometime in the next year.
Wonderful. Isn't that wonderful? Of all the people that God would call to take this choice plum of a church, and I could imagine the amount of money that's being thrown at this, because this is Hollywood, right? This is where the music scene and the actors and everything are all, this is going to be a big deal. So who's he going to trust with this? Is he going to trust those feisty leprechauns, the doolies? I don't think so.
Oh, no.
I don't think so. This is one's going to go to a Houston.
Go to the kids.
Yeah.
So the dynasty continues, doesn't it?
And so they look at this and they think, Houston's, we don't have a problem.
They do.
They do indeed have a problem. I love what it said here in this article. It said, Ben Houston insisted that his plans for Hillsong's expansion to LA were not indiscriminate, but are intentional, prayed about, and thought through.
Oh, that's nice.
And fucking nepotistic.
Yes.
I love it. That's like indiscriminate. Fucking discrimination up your fucking wazoo. This is so discriminatory in a positive sense towards you, Ben and Lucille Houston.
But they would see it that they are blessed because they're rubbing shoulders with all the elite in Hollywood.
Yeah, that's right. Hashtag blessed. Hashtag blessed. So what we've seen here today, Reverend Dr. Brian, is that we have seen serious evidence of nepotistic dynasties, both small and large, in the name of the Lord
And
in
that's okay.
Australian Pentecostalism.
If it's in the name of the Lord, you can get away with it, can't you? Because God has told me, we've prayed about it, we've been given a vision, we've been given a word, and
We've been given jobs for the boys.
yeah, but dare not question that. Because if you do that, you're questioning God, aren't you?
Because do you remember what they used to say to us once upon a time? And you probably heard this a lot as well, and you hear this from the leaders, is church is a theocracy, not a democracy.
Yes.
Right, which reminds me again of this hereditary title shit. I mean, that's really what happened in those European monarchies. God put them there, and God would cause the boy or the daughter to be born to me, and that is the next person. It's all God. It's all on God. So it's a theocracy, not a democracy, and you don't have a say.
No, you absolutely don't. And particularly, you look at the rise of the megachurch in Australia, I mean, globally, but if we're just concentrating on Australia here, I can't think, I'm not involved in the scene, I'm not close to it, and I'm not actually that close with too many people that are. But I'd love to hear examples of where these churches have been handed over to someone who's not related or someone who's not part of one of these royal Pentecostal families.
Oh, look, it does happen because there are times where as I said before, the person is not, the son or the daughter is not old enough yet, or the person gets removed, or something goes horribly wrong, and or there just isn't a child at all. So occasionally, it definitely does happen within Pentecostal churches that that people get it, but by and large, this nepotism is still a huge issue. And I think the thing that really struck me is, and I want to say this to people that are involved in it, not those of us that have walked away. When you give your money to these churches, you are actually giving your money to families and family businesses.
Yep.
And so you could argue, hey, this is how family businesses work in the world. You've got camping store, for example, and our family's been, running that for a while, and, they hand it on to their children 100%, right? And that's okay for them. But these are churches, and this money doesn't come from selling stuff, etc. It comes from donations, and it comes from communities building their communities. And so in essence, this should be owned and controlled by the church communities, and not just in some sort of superficial way with stacked boards and, full of sycophants, etc. And these boards organize themselves legally. I'm not suggesting that they're not, but is it ethical? Is it right? And who are these board members in your local church or in your huge mega church? Where does the power, where does the control actually land? And when you're giving 10% of your salary, right, as a tithe and offering every week, who are you giving that money to? Where's it going? Who's controlling it? I think you've got to ask these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm involved in a couple of boards for organisations, and I can tell you the diversity on those boards is enormous, and it's purposefully done that way to make sure that we are challenging the status quo, that we are challenging some of the assumptions there. And I would dare say that you're right. They stack these so the assumptions aren't challenged, so the status quo isn't challenged, and they can continue along their merry way. As you say, these are businesses. They started off as our interview with Jeff Bullock. Jeff said that it started out in all sincerity, but I'm not quite sure that's where it's landed. These are.
You're more than not quite sure. This is not where it's landed.
Yeah, but I like to understate things. I'm Australian.
Fair enough.
So, but it's horrendous. You look at this. This is people's spirituality. It's their eternal destiny, if you're looking through their eyes, and it's being messed with in this way.
The thing is, for me, Brian, is people are being called to sacrifice for building funds or for missions or whatever it is that they're sacrificing to, but the money is going to these small groups of people and even families that have ultimate control. And yes, it's legal, and yes, it's all set up in a way. But Nathan Zampronio on the Leaving Hillsong podcast, please go back and have a listen to his podcast if you want. But he really talked about how the way this is all structured, that ultimately it can't be taken away from the leaders. They have these rights of veto and all this kind of stuff. So when you give your money to these groups, you're not building your community, you're building these family businesses. And on top of that, Brian, is the taxation breaks that they get because they are religious organizations. They're not family businesses according to the taxation office, they are churches. And yet they've got all these tax breaks and they're, jobs for the boys and nepotism and all this kind of stuff. It's just so wrong. Stop giving your money to these family businesses.
Yeah, it's madness, isn't it? Like, I'd hate to, well, actually, I'd really love to know how much actually comes through the offering plates every week at, the biggest Hillsong churches, because it would be enormous. And it's...
I think that BBC doco said that it was hundreds of millions of dollars a year are raised through donations and offerings at Hillsong. Hundreds of millions a year.
It'd have to be. And then you think of the music. The music would make tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, this stuff hits the global charts, Billboard charts, the ARIA charts in Australia. I mean, this stuff is making some serious coin.
And then it's all going into the families, and then it's all handed on to the families. So when Brian stood down, I don't think his kids are old enough yet, or his kids are in a position yet to be able to do this. So he had to give it to Go Chok Tong, aka those leprechaunish doolies, to take over. But it's just interim, temporary, you're not a Houston, or interim, temporary, you're not an Evans, or interim, temporary, you're not a Smith. This is the way it works. And I get angry. Can you hear me? It just pisses me off. And I just think you're getting ripped off, people. Give your 10%. Here's another thing, right? I remembered this. The Bible says, he that gives to the poor lends to the Lord. So stop giving to the rich people. If you believe in prosperity, you're supposed to give to the poor. So stop giving to these people. Find your charities, find the things that are doing, give to them, keep giving, keep being a Christian, but stop getting ripped off.
And, demand some accountability around where this money goes. I haven't looked. I'll be interested, actually, I'll do this after this episode, of getting on and Googling and see if you can see the annual general meeting documents, because I know the organisation I work for, we have to publicly declare those documents. We have to put them on a website. They have to be registered, and that actually shows the transparency of the finances in there. Also, our setup as a board, our activity, how we've acquitted against any funds that have come in from our funders. So I wonder if they have to be that transparent. Let's Google.
And maybe they are, but ultimately that doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? You can keep all the rules, but is it ethical? And I say it's not.
No, I imagine not as well. And it is quite crazy. And I mean, you do see this all the time, unfortunately, across the world. So how do we challenge it? What do we do? What do we do with this? Do we just stay angry, or do we challenge it somehow? Do we ask people to be empowered to ask the questions, to demand accountability, demand transparency, or they withhold their funds? Well, it's really difficult because there's so much manipulation within these megachurches that, hey, don't argue with us, argue with God. God's put us in this place. God's told us to do this. Don't argue with that.
Yeah, well, see, that's exactly what the kings and queens of Europe used to say. We are put here by God, and if you argue with us, you're arguing with God. But actually, we worked out that was bullshit, and we have whole new forms of government. And so maybe that's what needs to happen. But hey, it won't. But nevertheless, if I was in there and I was listening to this podcast, I'd be asking questions and I'd be shifting very uncomfortably in my seat.
So, listeners, if you do have people that, or if you're in a megachurch still yourself, or you have friends within megachurches, maybe encourage them to listen to this. It's all there. It's public information. We haven't made any of this up. A lot of it's from their own websites, let alone from any websites that are giving any commentary on it. It's their own information.
Exactly right. So I hope you've enjoyed our little Pelican Brief style episode today. I was Julia Roberts. You were Denzel Washington. I think they were the ones in this. Or was it Matthew McConaughey? I can't remember.
I don't know. I'd like to be Matthew McConaughey. Everyone loves him. And, I've got a man crush on Matthew McConaughey too.
Fair enough. Well, that's the end of this episode. We've run well over time. Thank you for staying with us. It's been a good one.
It needed the time. So thank you for staying with us. Thank you for listening. Share it. Google away. If you have any questions around this or question what we've said, Google away public information.
Yeah, and just remember, nepotism is not okay. It's not okay in the government. It's not okay in public office, it's not okay in business, and it's certainly not okay in church.
Although stand by, in a couple of years, my daughters are grown up and I probably will hand the podcast over to them.
Oh, wonderful. Good job. All right, mate. I will see you next week.
Later.